Hi, I'm Cara Sofoco,
Hi, I'm Chantelle Lunt.
and you're listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar, a weekly show where we take a critical look at the news agenda and talk about those stories being overreported and those flying completely under the radar and not being talked about enough. Over the Top, Under the Radar exists thanks to our Patreon community. If you sign up today, you'll get access to a bonus episode this week. Very excited about our co-host today. Chantelle Lunt is an academic, writer, and activist based in Merseyside. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Chantelle.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me, Caris. I've been like a real keen fan for ages. So yes, excited to be here.
This is part of a shameless campaign for us to become friends, which I just want to be open about now. Chantal and I we were both speaking at Left Field in Glastonbury this year, along with Gary, former co-host. And I was very clear to Gary, I was like, I need to be her friend. So you need to help me with that. And then we spoke at another panel event.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is my campaign to make you my friend.
Excellent.
How's it going?
It's going really well. I do think it will happen. But thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you. So you do like various things and wear different hats. The panel I saw you on, you were talking about your anti-racist activism, and you're an academic as well. So you're doing a research project. What are you working on at the moment in the world of academia?
So my PhD is on the further educational journeys of young people in care. So there's a real lack of representation and young people gaining access to higher education if they've got care experience. And there's a real overrepresentation of care experience people in homelessness statistics, criminal justice system, and all of those things. And there's a lot of stuff happening at a higher education level, but there's the key aspects of a young person's leaving care journey, and B, just the whole conversation that is further education. And there's a real research gap there. So that's why I focus my research on that area.
Oh, and you're doing a project to do with Northern Ireland, is that right?
Yeah, so at the moment, so first shameless plug of the evening, Caris.
I've many as you like.
Yeah, I've worked with Northwest Migrants Forum for like 5 years doing various projects. And as with the wider UK, there's just increasing racial hostility. So we're really using education and narrative to counter that. So we just finished a project which was Northern Ireland's Hidden Black History, where we highlighted, local Black heroes like Dr. Raphael Almato, who moved to Northern Ireland and was a Nobel Prize winner who discovered the cure to various parasites, but found his home there and was a real activist who people might not know about, who are very much a part of Northern Ireland's history and an incredible Black people. But now we're doing more contemporary history, so the people who are with us, and we're celebrating Black people who are either Northern Irish, living in Northern Ireland, or have Northern Irish heritage. So if you're listening and you're thinking, do you know what, I know someone they should really be giving flowers to, please do get in touch because I'd love to celebrate them.
Chantal and I have both taken a look at the news agenda and picked two stories that we think are being overreported or flying completely under the radar. And if you don't mind, I thought I would go first. My over the top for this week is Shabana Mahmood's asylum reforms, which I'm guessing most people listening from the UK will be familiar with. But for those who don't know, Shabana Mahmood is the Home Secretary. So she's in charge of migration, crime, borders, and she's relatively new in post. She got the job about 10 weeks ago in a reshuffle, and she has been very proactive in announcing a raft of new asylum reforms. These have rightly got lots of coverage, but I've got a few issues with what the media have picked up on. But for those who haven't looked, basically, Shabana Mahmood's come out with a ton of really right-wing policies to make it even harder for people to claim asylum, to make it harder for people who are here as refugees to get permanent residence, and even going down to the details of allowing the government to confiscate the jewelry of people who come into the country trying to seek refuge or asylum, which, I mean, yeah, has some like pretty unpleasant overtones, and did lead to a Home Office minister stressing in Parliament that we won't be taking people's wedding rings, which, yeah, always a sign that you're in a good place. I mean, I'm guessing you've heard about their policies, like anything that jumped out to you that was like
Other than
noteworthy?
the absolute horror of seeing the jewellery headline, and I did see Shabana furiously backpedaling in Parliament, but you do ask the question, well, you did give the briefing to the press. So is it a case of you don't like how it's been received, or that you're not going to do it now because we're still talking about assets, even if we're not talking about, gold and jewellery?
it's not giving a lot of class, the idea that we're going to be like rooting through people's jewelry. Like, should we just check if they've got gold fillings while we're at it? But yeah, so I mean, for context for everyone, she announced the policy in Parliament this week, but journalists have been getting a series of briefings and like leaks in the run up to it. She did a media round on Sunday, so she did all the big political shows where she was talking about these reforms. And so I don't think it's over the top for people to talk about the policy announcement, but there are kind of three things I want to talk about that I think are being covered too much or not covered at all when it comes to these reforms. I mean, it should go without saying that it's pretty gross how inhumane these policies are. We're talking about people who, like, we've got a really toxic debate at the moment about asylum and immigration. But the reality is, and the Home Office's own figures show, most people coming to claim asylum and to come here as refugees are fleeing from countries that it is not safe for them to be in. So the idea that even if you are a legitimate refugee or asylum seeker, you are fleeing persecution, that the UK government is going to be like rifling through your belongings for anything valuable. You're going to be given these like really short stints that you're allowed to stay in the country. So every 2 years, you're going to be having to renew your status. And even up to after being in the UK for 20 years, at which point you might have married and had kids and built a life, if suddenly your country of origin is deemed safe, there's this idea that like people can just be taken back to the country that they've come from. So like, it's inhumane. And, a phrase someone uses, it's almost like a performative cruelty of like, it's pretty shameless how clearly this Labour government is trying to hemorrhage the tide of people switching towards reform by just like beating up on refugees and asylum seekers. And like, probably, I think that that's gross. I think it's gross. It's not being talked about enough. And like, what the reality is for people who are already vulnerable and coming to this country is. So that's pretty bad. The thing I really want to talk about, though, is I don't think it's going to be effective. And it being inhumane should be enough on its own. But unfortunately, we're in a situation where there are certain people in society that just seem to be fair game. And I think there are two reasons that won't be effective. So, number one, so people have push and pull factors that determine where they go to claim refuge. For most people, the reason they leave the country that they were born in or the country that they're from and go somewhere else is a push factor. So, a war. Like, as no matter how much kind of propaganda there is, the statistics are still clear. Like, the top five countries that people are claiming asylum from are Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Bangladesh, and Syria. If you make that just about small boats, the top five countries are Afghanistan, Syria, Eritrea, Iran, and Sudan. So people are being pushed from the countries that they're in. That's the reality. There's very little evidence to suggest that pull factors, so like what makes people come to the UK, are the things that determine where people go and where they choose to claim asylum. But even if that were the case, you're then assuming that like everyone who decides to go on a small boat has like got their smartphone out and they're Googling best country to settle to. So like, it's like these policies send a signal to people that Labour is worried won't vote for them again, that they're really tough and mean towards asylum seekers, but it won't actually, like, we will reduce the number of people claiming refuge here if we're just denying them appeals, which is one of the policy reforms. But like, this actually isn't the way to disincentivize people coming, partly because the reason people come is that it's not safe at home. It's not that it's like super cushy here. So it's all based on this like really sketchy policy framework that won't actually work. And Home Office's own kind of analysis and insight says many asylum seekers have little to no understanding of things like welfare policies. So you're tinkering with all of these things that people don't know about before they come, which kind of gets me to the other reason that people come to the UK. Like, one reason is it's not safe where they are, but the other reason is, like, to the extent that we do have data, people come because of networks, language, family links, and diaspora. AKA, a big reason people come to the UK is because they speak English. And a big reason they speak English is because of the British Empire. So like, if you don't want loads of asylum seekers and refugees, you need a time machine to go back and not have conquered loads of places and destabilize them. And then you could reduce asylum. But confiscating people's jewelry, not their wedding rings, isn't the way to do it. And I think that is completely missing from pretty much all media articles. Like you get a little bit in the BBC, but this idea that there is not really a provable link that by changing the pull factors, you're going to reduce claimants. It's just like, it's absolutely maddening. And yeah, it's the main thing that I think is over the top.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's all roads point to colonialism, and it's the idea that asylum seekers are the idea that asylum seekers are sort of on the phone browsing safe countries in the way that we would look for a holiday is absolutely ludicrous. And I think it's absolutely about winning votes. We've seen the fact that Nigel Farage has welcomed it, the fact that Tommy Robinson is tweeting about it tells us exactly who that was aimed towards. But I don't even think the target audience of this headline grabber believe it. So it's not even had the desired effect of winning votes. It's just alienated Labour's core voter base and horrified us all.
Yeah. And I think that kind of comes to the second point of ineffective. Like this policy won't work in that it's not the thing that's going to reduce the number of people coming over on small boats or seeking refuge in the UK. Like there's very little evidence that's going to make a material difference. Aside from the appeals thing, sure, if we limit the number of times people can appeal, given how crappy our system is and how often we refuse people asylum that deserve it, sure, we don't let people appeal, we'll have a few fewer people. But we're talking about like hundreds of people. I think the second reason it's not effective is, Shabana Mahmood was very clear when she sat on the sofas, TV studios on Sunday to left-wing voters, a lot of traditional Labour voters, that if you don't like this, you won't like what's coming next. What she's basically saying is it's either I do this or Reform do it. And I think that, you touched on it there. These policies are so right wing, no one on the right is objecting to them. Tory party have broadly welcomed them. Nigel Farage has said that, Shabana Mahmood should be a Reform member. What a compliment. And Tommy Robinson, far right outrider, no longer an outrider, increasingly mainstream, tweeted a few days ago, the Overton window has been obliterated. Well done, Patriots. So for those who don't know, the Overton window is a term for like what is mainstream or politically accepted discourse. And, political insiders are always talking about shifting the Overton window, shifting what's politically acceptable. So shifting it to the left or the right. And in case we were in any doubt, Tommy Robinson has said very clearly, and he isn't completely wrong to give himself and his fellow patriots credit, that discourse around migration, asylum has gone so far to the right that a far right fascist is able to welcome Labour Party policy. And like, I just want to pull at this because the received wisdom of Shabana Mahmood and the people around her is that people who don't like this policy are a bunch of soft lefties who are out of touch. They're doing the hard, they're making the tough calls to stop the right getting in. As you said, like, that's bullshit. The more that Labour buy into this narrative that most people claiming asylum are these like fraudulent scammers, black and brown men coming over the channel in boats, them they're in hotels, they're sexually assaulting people. Like we all know what the kind of crap that Tommy Robinson spouts. If we say that that story is true, the logical conclusion at the next election is to vote for Reform, or indeed Tommy Robinson's even further to the right party of Reform, like Alliance or something. So it's like this idea that this is the most effective way to take on anti-immigrant politicians isn't true. People hugely distrust the Labour Party and the mainstream parties to deal with immigration. So the more that we bang on about it, and like I do want to talk to you a bit about, I don't know if people saw, but Shabana Mahmood was in Parliament defending these. She did this weird thing that made me think, like, is she okay? Where she said, and she said this as a lot of part of this, not only if you don't like this, you're going to get reform if I don't do this. But the other thing she sort of said was she talked about a slur that she's had hurled at her. So she said, I'm the person that gets called an effing P. I won't say the word because immigration and asylum is tearing this country apart. And I didn't what did you think of that? Like, what was she trying to say there?
You see, I think she was on the back foot and she was in a defensive space. And rather than defending the policy, which she should have been able to have done if had you've raised it was a defensible policy, which it's not going to be effective. So she knew she couldn't defend the policy. So what she did was deflected by saying, well, I get called this. But I think beneath the fact that her disclosing that essentially shut it down because no one wanted to come back against her using that slur or say that isn't your lived experience. Aside from that, what it's actually feeding into is almost this notion that because of asylum seekers, life for people of colour in the UK has been made harder. And this idea that, that it's their fault that we're experiencing racism and therefore we should throw them under the bus, which I think is worse. So within that, I think a lot of people have lost what she was actually saying. It massively represents internalized racism. Is my life's become really hard because of all this racism that Tommy Robinson et al. Are spouting. So therefore, I'm going to echo it. Why? That's not going to make our lives any easier. You've mainstreamed what they're saying now.
And I think, and exactly, and I think like it's the only moment in the last few days I had a bit of are you okay, on like a slight welfare concern? Because it's just like, and again, our overwhelmingly white media has been a bit uncomfortable talking about it. Understandably, they don't want to repeat the slur. They feel cautious. But like, as you say, the logic of what she's laid out, and anyone who's not white listening to this will presumably also be like, doesn't make sense, is that she's getting racially abused on the street. So we better do something about those asylum seekers. Like, anyone who's not white in this fucking country knows that asylum seekers have nothing to do with us getting racially abused. And the people that are racially abusing you and using those words are not objecting to you being here because of how you got here. They're objecting to you being here. They don't think you're British. They don't think you have the right to be in the UK. And as you say, it's like the worst kind of victim blaming and kind of like the lowest common denominator politics of like, well, we've got to throw those lot under the bus so that we don't get mistreated. And I actually thought it was like a real moment of someone saying the quiet part out loud.
Absolutely, absolutely, because we know that this is something that we sometimes hear within our communities. They're making life harder for us and we need it to stop. And on the one hand, you can understand that people just want to stop being attacked in the street and they want to feel safer. But ultimately, history has shown us that, okay, we could bring in these draconian policies, we can take the wedding rings off asylum seekers, we can always do those things. But once you open that door, you cannot close it. They will only want more and more and more. And then it will be people who are first generation migrants, second generation migrants, and then it will be another marginalised community. We all know the poem about once they start up with the trade unionists. It is never enough. And so we don't throw communities under the bus. We don't allow our own communities to be divided by this almost morality discourse. We resist it and we stand with anyone who's more vulnerable to this current far-right narrative than we are. So it's disappointing on so many levels to see her say that. And I think, as you pointed to, Karis, it's people of colour who really need to challenge that, because a lot of people won't really understand what was being said, because all they will see was someone who looked quite vulnerable disclosing racism, which is always an awful thing, but there was a lot more to it.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the times when you just feel the kind of limit of having an overwhelmingly white media and having this like British people feel uncomfortable talking about race and racism and this sort of awkwardness. And like the grim reality is, to the extent we have any data, racism and hate crimes are on the rise. And that is not because there are more people claiming asylum. It is because politicians and the media have normalized things that used to be beyond the pale. Like the last set of hate crime figures from England and Wales, which let's remember is people who actually bothered to report being abused in the street or having some sort of like racist or xenophobic abuse. Like those figures are on the rise, according to the Home Office. Royal College of Nursing released like a horrible statistic recently saying there's been a 55% rise in members facing racist abuse. And we see this when like 100,000 people join Tommy Robinson on the streets of London. This normalizing of racist discourse, of far-right discourse, actually makes us all less safe. And there is no amount of caping to Tommy Robinson and Nigel Farage that's going to change that. I wanted to say a huge thank you to Anna, Julia G, Leah, and Rebecca, who joined us on Patreon this week, and to Ellie and Rachel, who upgraded their Patreon support. Thank you so much. We're a tiny team making the podcast on an absolute shoestring. We only exist because a few hundred people support us on Patreon. They help to cover our production costs and mean that the show can keep running. We need 94 more supporters for the show to be sustainable, and that is why I'm asking you to join us on Patreon today. Over the Top Under the Radar has an unashamedly left-wing look at the news agenda. And because of Patreon supporters, we don't need to worry about chasing advertising or clicks. If you've been listening for a while and thinking that you're glad the show exists and you want it to keep going, then we need you. Seriously. Packages start at just £3 a month. That's it. Less than a coffee or a pint, certainly if you live in London, and it helps to keep us going. Patreon.com/over the top under the radar. As well as joining the team of people keeping the pod going, you'll get an extra episode each week and access to our exclusive under WhatsApp community where we get to geek out between episodes. Right, back to the show.
My over the top is an issue that absolutely should be reported and should be reported widely, but the reporting that has happened has not actually spoken to the true nature of the review. So it was a child safeguarding practice review about the death of Sara Sharif in 2023. So what usually happens is a few years later, you'll have the lessons learned reviews and reports that come out. So the report came out. It was more than 62 pages. I'm sure you can guess some of the headlines focused on a really small part of that report.
So for people who don't know, Sara Sharif, you're probably familiar with her face. She was a young girl. It was horrible. She was killed when she was about 10 years old. And there were a lot of images of her, either kind of some with and some without a hijab.
Yeah. So Sara Sharif was 10 years old when she was killed by her father, and her stepmother also was imprisoned because she was part of the abuse that happened to her. The big picture that everyone went with was one of her in a hijab, but the headline was that the part of the reason that she was failed was because people were too scared to be called racist. And some of the headlines were the professionals were too scared to be called racist. I did read the report, and there was a small sentence in the report about neighbours saying that. So it was a part of the report, but a very small part of the report. But actually, a lot of the report actually spoke about teachers, for instance, asked them why she was wearing a hijab at a young age and really having those conversations. The bit that was underreported in a lot of the headlines that really laser focused on that one element was that the actual recommendations of the report around race, racism and culture weren't about those comments made by the neighbours, but were actually about things like the biological mum was Polish, and the social services didn't provide a translator. So there was a lot of domestic abuse going on at home. This child was on a child protection register from the point of pregnancy. So if you imagine when she was in her mum's tummy, she was on a child protection register because of domestic abuse. She went into care briefly once during her childhood, but for the majority of time was bounced between her mum and dad, with her dad finally gaining custody, who was the primary abuser, in 2019, and then was manipulating the children to say that it was mum who was harming them. Mum could not speak English, and they failed on many occasions. And there's questions to be asked, and there's reporting on incidents involving mum, but she couldn't speak English. And a lot of what was happening within the family home and the abuse, the report actually notes if there was a translator, this might have helped. It also notes that the stepmom was talking about the cultural shame and needing to protect the family image over children, which wasn't fully explored. So what the report was actually talking about was cultural competency, and the fact that race and culture wasn't given the level of significance that it needed to be given to actually highlight some of these safeguarding failures. But the media really focused on this one sentence within a huge thousands of word report, which was a remark from the neighbours, to which I would always answer, well, what's worse, being called racist or a child losing their life?
Yeah, it's like I mean, this touched on your area of expertise as an academic, doesn't it? It's like tragic on two levels, because it's hearing that a child was already sort of known to services when they were like before they were even born, just is really heartbreaking to hear. And then to hear that the death was preventable, but like not because people were being weird about racism, but because of things like a translator. Like, is this about like child protection services not working? Is this about underfunding? Like, what, as someone who's kind of working in this area, like, you've read the serious case review, what is the aside from the media hype? And you're right, a lot of it is just about headlines about her being forced to wear a hijab, and just this really kind of gruesome reporting that we often get when women and girls are killed and abused. Like, what's your read on like what actually went wrong and what needs to be changed?
So the bit that comes through again and again and again is domestic abuse. Is that this man was an abuser. he not only manipulated the children, the women around him, but he also manipulated professionals. So, for instance, there was a recommendation that he go on a perpetrator course that was never completed. After he'd got custody of the children, he was allowed to remove them from school and say that he was homeschooling them, which essentially took them completely from public view. And one of the visits that was supposed to happen within 2 weeks of them being homeschooled didn't happen. And also, professionals went to the wrong house. So they were, as with all of these reports, and we've seen it since Victoria Columbia in 2003, there were countless missed opportunities. There was a lot of multi-agency work and that did not happen. Again and again and again, you've seen the school were raising things and raising things. The school was saying she's got bruises. The school was saying she's been hurt. The school were constantly raising things. And then social services weren't following up. So there was a failure of multi-agency work. And then unfortunately, Karis, it's not massively different to every other case review that you see around children and young people. And that includes baby P, that includes multiple young children who are white and you know, from multiple backgrounds. So it annoyed me a little bit that a lot of the media acted as if it wouldn't have happened had people not been afraid to be called racist, because the report doesn't say that. It's a small part of the report talks about cultural competency and notably that if people had a relationship or a consulted with the mosque, that they would have been able to tell them that it was unusual. It would have been unusual for an 8-year-old to wear a hijab if other people in the family home weren't. So that actual report is saying, had you had that, you know, that relationship and asked some more questions and done that, maybe you would have more context. But it seems like there was almost this, oh, well, we're just going to treat everybody the same, that became problematic because there were clear needs and there were clear things being spoken into this family situation that weren't addressed. So it's a really, really sad case. And I feel that within the headlines that have just laser focused on one sentence of the report, the wider findings around domestic abuse, around homeschooling, and around the need for that cultural competency and that support with basic things like a translator. Can you imagine a mum who's having a child removed and also all of this stuff going on in the background, and we don't even know what's happening because you haven't been able to, you've put her through court proceedings and you haven't been able to allow her to represent herself effectively. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned, but I would just say, please look beyond the headline and do take the time out to read all of the other recommendations in the report, of which they said that none should be taken in isolation and they all form part of a whole picture of failings. And obviously just thinking of this beautiful young child and a family at this time, because it's awful.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing it up, because it's, again, yeah, people are probably familiar with Sara's face, even if they haven't sort of read about the story. I guess the thing that's like in my mind is it's this weird thing where it is sort of tells the story of the bigger problem we've got in media discourse right now, where journalists and, you know, far right actors are really quick to jump on anything that suggests that like black and brown men are sexual or like abusers or sexual predators, or this idea again, which obviously connects to the sort of grooming gangs stories about, you know, well, no one wants to seem racist, so they're letting like specifically often Muslim men, you know, run riot and be violent. And whereas actually like, and I know you do work in campaigning on this, like actually like issue is male violence, like the issue is men who are perpetrators. And as you said, like it's the prevalence of domestic abuse and like the common denominator is men. It's not like black and
Absolutely.
brown men, like it's men. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, like the way things are being distorted.
Absolutely. So I've been at a violence against women and girls roundtable in Merseyside today because if people aren't aware, Merseyside has the highest number of not only femicide, where women are murdered, but matricide as well, where mothers are murdered by their sons. So we have the highest rate, even within this was from 2023, but even within the last 8 months, we're still the highest rates for both. And it's quite interesting. So if we do look at somewhere like Merseyside, 90% of women are killed at home. Of those women who are killed, 90% are killed in the home and by somebody known to them. So whether it's a former partner or a current partner, it's somebody known to these women. And we actually have the lowest rate of women killed by somebody not known to them. So you have the lowest rate of women killed by strangers. So that tells us that the least safe place for a woman to be is at home with a
Mm.
partner. And yet when we had the riots in 2023, one of the key instigators of those riots and one of the key bits of discourse that the far right rally around is that asylum seekers and those in hotels and migrants and black and brown men are almost the single biggest risk to women and girls. And every bit of data that we've got tells us that this is not the case. So not only is that dangerous, as in it's pointing over there and saying the single biggest stress is outside the home, but it's almost invisibilizing everything that is happening inside the home as not relevant or, at worst, acceptable. And there's been,
And
well,
I was going to say, and you mentioned riots there. That's because the area you're from, is it Knowsley?
Knowsley.
Yeah, Knowsley. Like, so Knowsley, where you're from, had riots before the riots that we saw in 2024 and
Yeah.
2025.
So
Could you just explain a bit about that?
Knowsley was one of the first places to have riots outside hotels. And there's a number of reasons behind it, but there was a lot of misinformation being spread around the area, and there was a lot of panic about this risk to women and girls from people inside the hotels. So we really saw the power of this narrative that the people inside hotels were a threat to women and children. We saw that firsthand, and we really tried to raise the alarm to say, this spread so quickly online and it was able to mobilise so many people outside a hotel who then set fire to a police van. And when I went the next day, even when all of that was over and spoke to some people, they were convinced that everyone inside the hotel was a predator. People still hadn't had that kind of realization of how far things have got to almost burn down a hotel. So that was almost the template for what happened in 2024 again in our region after the tragedy in Southport. So this mobilisation around concerns for women and children has become a template. But interestingly, since then, we've had data that's shown that 40% of those who turn up outside hotels housing asylum seekers are actually known to the police and have had reports made against them for domestic abuse. So we've 40%, that's ridiculously high. So it's almost provided cover for people who could potentially be a significant risk to women and children themselves. So we've really wanted to campaign and sort of raise the alarm about what's happening, because it's not just women of colour. There's a lot of local women. While all of this is happening, we've still had women dying in our region. That doesn't stop because we've got the highest rates of femicides. So recently we've had a number of young women dying in Knowsley being killed by the partners. And I've noticed that in these groups where we're getting this constant stream of men in hotels, a lot of local women have started pushing back and saying, well, actually, what are you saying to your friends? Because the girl who died last week was killed by a partner and he wasn't in a hotel. So are all of you men who are talking about these asylum seekers and migrants actually having the same conversations with your friends? Because that's what we need to be happening now, because it's happening by men in our communities, living with women in our communities. So there seems to have been that realization. And we started working on a campaign, which became a national campaign called Women Against the Far Right, which was women who were becoming really frustrated about how the far right were weaponising what was happening, instances of abuse or allegations of abuse, and saying that it was solely because of refugees, asylum seekers and migrants. And we're not at all saying that these people would never do such a thing, but it's such a small proportion of a much bigger picture that there was a real dangerous narrative that was happening that was invisibilising victims, invisibilising women's voices, and often speaking over them in a way that was quite dangerous. So we formed the campaign to push back and to say that this current narrative isn't representing the reality of what's happening on the ground. It isn't actually helping women and it isn't making them any safer.
So my under the radar relates to Meta. Big company, owns Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, run by Mark Zuckerberg. A couple of weeks ago, a Reuters journalist got some leaked documents from Meta that estimated 10% of its 2024 revenue came from fraudulent ads or scammy ads. So just so we're clear how much we're talking about, $16 billion. The story kind of broke a couple of weeks ago, as I say. Reuters picked it up. It's got very little coverage in the UK until Bastion of Socialism, the Financial Times, had a comment piece from Martin Wolf, who's an economist and their kind of like big chief economics commentator. I'm still really baffled as to like how little coverage the level of like fraud and scams on Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp gets in the UK media. Like, which is a consumer rights group in the UK, estimates that nearly half of all financial fraud, so, people that get tricked into transferring money out of their bank account or like fraudulent cryptocurrencies. There's lots of kind of celebrity deep fakes. Martin Wolf wrote about the fraud on Meta because he has been used for fraud on Meta. So Martin Wolf's a respected economist. Someone had like used AI to spoof a video or an ad where he's giving investment advice. And it's really interesting because, Martin Wolf's kind of a big dog in the world of economics, Financial Times. Most people have heard of it. He talks about how hard it was once someone had shown him those ads to get them taken down by Meta. So, big journalist working for a big news outlet talks about the process they had to go through to get these ads taken down. So, once they'd flagged the ads, still thousands of copycats were being made. And the only data we have suggests that nearly 1 million people saw those ads in the EU. And that's because only the EU requires Meta to disclose things like how many scammy ads you're seeing. So we've got a platform that has, by its own data, loads and loads of fraud on it, like loads of scams, loads of people giving away money to like bad actors for dodgy products or literally just being ripped off. It's making so much money from the fraud that it's not incentivized to deal with it. So Martin Wolf and the Reuters piece look at how hard it is. If you're a scammy advertiser, you're selling something dodgy, or you've got like a fake cryptocurrency, it's really hard for you to get taken off Meta's platforms. In fact, some estimates suggest it's a 50 strikes and you're out policy. Coverage that we've seen suggests that if you are likely to be scammy and Meta doesn't actually take you off, they just charge you more for the ads. And if you are likely to be scammed, you are more likely to see more scammy ads. It's a really sketchy situation. So it's flown under the radar. Barely seen it picked up by UK media, even though most people reading The Sun, The Daily Mail, The Guardian, The Mirror, watching the BBC, I'm sure people who've been scammed. Like, so many people are being scammed on social media. It is, as Which estimate, the biggest source of scams. And even Which's estimates suggest, say, where did this, they say if you've been scammed out of money, like where did you first see the ad or how did you first get scammed? And so their estimate is most of it starting on social media, but they're not including people who put their information into a website and then get called by someone, which again, arguably is social media. So like Facebook's a huge hub for fraud. So there's two reasons I think journalists should be talking about it more. Number one, loads of people getting scammed online. It's a huge story. We should be talking about it. It is like the new frontier of scamming. And then the second is Keir Starmer and the government made a big song and dance about the fact that they were going to put platforms like Meta on the hook for fraud and scams, because ultimately right now, Facebook makes money out of scammers and it doesn't have to do anything if you get scammed and give 10 grand to someone. Like, Meta doesn't have to pay for that. So there's no cost. Right now, it looks like there's a pretty sweet benefit. Even though the Online Safety Act has passed, which is a piece of legislation designed to regulate technologies, taken years to get through. And even though Keir Starmer promised, and there are provisions to recoup money from tech companies that are committing fraud, Labour aren't doing anything. To the point that, and this is, one of those weird times where I'm going to now defend the British banking industry. The British banking industry have been like, hey, bro, we're paying for like all the fraud right now. And tech companies aren't. So it's got to a point where banks are complaining because they're paying, they're the ones having to refund your money if you get scammed or if there's fraud. And like, I don't want to cape for big banks, but if they have increased security and made it harder for you to get scammed and people are getting scammed from social media, then like, why wouldn't tech companies pay the price? And I think generally, in a week where Labour's been bending over backward to kick asylum seekers, it just feels a bit mad to me that some of the biggest, most powerful and richest companies in the world who operate in the UK with impunity, paying the bare minimum of tax, doing the bare minimum in terms of regulation, messing up young people's mental health, probably messing up all of our mental health. And like, they're not even having to pay for scams on their platform. Meanwhile, we're shaking down refugees for their jewelry. And I just make it make sense. So that's my under the radar. I don't get why we don't talk more about big tech companies. And yeah, why is it just Martin Wolf and the FT who are out here saying they should pay for the fraud? So yeah, have you ever been scammed on Facebook? Like, what's your...
I mean, Facebook, I just feel like social media feels a little bit like the Wild West and no one knows quite what to do with it. And since Trump, it's clear that moderation and just regulation online has gone downhill. But you used to be able to see sort of a distinction between Twitter and then the metaverse, as in Meta was always a little bit more, they seem to have stricter rules and regulations. But since they all bent the knee to Trump when he got into office, it feels like there's no rules anymore. It feels like they've made a strategic business decision that whatever fine, if any fine, that any Western government is going to throw their way is worth it because the bottom line is the bottom line and they're making a profit. And it feels like governments like ours are scared to even say anything to them. But I do have to think, what is the benefit? Because as you say, they're not taxing them. We're all miserable. There's probably a mental health cost. What is the benefit to just allowing them to do whatever they want and never holding them to account?
Yeah, my suggestion for all of the Labour ministers that are definitely listening to this podcast is like consistently, and like not just in the UK, people don't like big tech companies and they don't have a lot of time for the people that run them. If you want someone to kick, why don't you kick them? We're not paying even like a one-off windfall tax, as you say, to deal with the mental health epidemic that we have. You're right. There has been a rolling back since Trump came in. So the very little that tech companies were doing to sort of deal with things like misinformation or sketchy political advertising has been rolled back. And yeah, it just feels like we're sort of permanently having these conversations about there's no money in the economy and everyone's struggling and the cost of living is so high. And there are literally people making out like bandits. And everyone's like, well, what about the refugees? What about the small boats? And it's
What
like,
about the
just,
large boats? What about the
yeah,
yachts?
what about the
That's the
yachts? What
issue.
about Mark
Tax
Zuckerberg?
the rich. It's not
Tax the
hard.
rich,
Tax the rich.
tax Mark Zuckerberg. And
Yes.
also just like make the bigger point about this like fraud and scams on platforms like Meta is that right now they're being incentivized to have scammers on the platform because they make money from them. Their own documents, which obviously they've said, it's more complicated than those documents that you saw. Like their own documents say, we make money from this. Until you create a penalty, you're incentivizing them to have scammers on the site. Like, why wouldn't they have scammers on the site? They're making good money from the scammers. Martin Wolf sort of ends this in his piece too of like, you have to find these companies if you want their behavior to change. And he is like a very high profile sort of person you'd assume Meta wouldn't want to piss off, has to go through all of these hoops to try and get his own image off the platform because Meta are making money from it. So yeah, tax the rich, tax the tech companies, and yeah, journalists who want to report on something like report on the scams. I think it's basically just Witch at the moment who talk about how much people are getting scammed. And I mean, it's not sexy, but it is pretty common. I'm sure a lot of people listening know people who've been scammed online. And yeah, taking on money. It's terrible. So that's my under the radar. What's yours?
So my under the radar in true British fashion is the weather. And Caris, I know it's not today, but it has been unseasonably warm. It's been unseasonably warm. And I noticed this more because I went to London. I'm always in London, but I was in London on Friday. And Liverpool was about to have a storm. So it was absolutely freezing. So I put my big coat on. I got to London and it was like the fires of hell. And I'm like walking through London, just delayering, like, oh my God. I literally thought, I kid you not, I was convinced I was in perimenopause. And I was
Oh my God, that is like anyone listening, like shout out to anyone else listening who's always like, am I perimenopausal? That
like,
is
it's a
iconic.
hot flash,
Oh my
it's
God.
a hot flash. And I was sat down with a colleague who was going to the same conference as me. And I was like, I think I'm in perimenopause. And she went, it's boiling, like it's London. London's really hot. And I was like, okay. And it was just so, so hot. And then lo and behold, when I did go online, the Evening Standard had done an article last Monday, basically saying the UK, but specifically London, has had the hottest 10 days in history. November 5th was the hottest bonfire night in history. And I know the weather has taken a turn, but I really feel like this has been underreported, not just the fact that we've had the hottest flash of weather in history, but the fact that the climate emergency is still here. Can we just give it a bit of recognition? Liverpool has since flooded. We've had about 10 roads cut off. Roads that when I was a child never flooded are like, we've got like 5 inches of water on them. The climate emergency is real. And also the UK government's response is inadequate. The Climate Change Committee have regularly reported on how inadequate the response was. So the UK's preparation for climate change is inadequate. They've been inadequate since 2023. We've not prepared local authorities. There's an inadequate approach to tackling climate risk. We've not improved. And this is quietly being reported on alongside the fact that we're actually seeing, I know it benefits us. We're not having to put the gas on. Fabulous, because no one can afford it. But there's a real conversation and there's a real reporting that needs to happen around the climate emergency at the moment, because it's still here. Things aren't getting better. No one's taking action. And we're just quietly watching our areas flood or burn in London, and no one's really saying anything.
It's a good under, because also it is the COP climate summit right now. So like in Brazil, world leaders and a ton of lobbyists, if some headlines are to be believed, like are gathering to talk about climate change. And you're right, it's really flown pretty under the radar in the UK.
How did they get to Brazil, Caris? Was it private jet?
Yeah, probs private jets, wasn't it? Air-conditioned private jets. Yeah, well, I mean, if you're listening to this right now and you are in London, you are probably like me dealing with the cold snap. But yeah, it has been unseasonably warm. And, we do know that weather isn't the same as climate change, but the fact that within all of our lifetimes, the weather in the UK has completely changed is terrifying. And yeah, it is one that it has gone under the radar. Although I do like the fact that it's specifically, is there a reason that it's London specifically? Is it just because it's really
I just think because it's
densely...
south. So whenever I go to London, it is always warmer. And obviously Scotland's freezing. But yeah, London always seems warmer. The tube is intolerable.
Yeah, I mean, you can't wear your big coat on the tube, Chantelle. That's never going to work.
I don't know what I was thinking.
Especially not the Central Line. That's a madness.
I saw someone in shorts. I was like, November. And then I got back to Liverpool and was freezing again. It's like, I can't take this.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, like climate change isn't it's not sexy, but like it is happening. And it does, I mean, like, I guess notable exception of The Guardian, who do lots of climate reporting. But yeah, it just feel like it's like the boiling frog thing where it's just kind of happening. And we're all like, yeah.
And we just resign to it because no one really knows. We've all changed our straws, you know what I mean, for what good that did.
Well, it's actually funny. Climate change is we're always being bombarded by like polling and focus groups. But climate change in the UK, at least, until, don't want to pretend it's like all good, but historically it's been something where most British people believe climate change is real and it's happening. And actually the polling issue is that because people get it, and it's not like America where it's polarized and politicized, people are like, yeah, climate change is real, it's happening. But then when you're told bring a bag for life and don't have a plastic straw, there's a bit of a credibility gap. And that historically at least, people have been like, well, yeah, it's real, but how will that fix it? And it's just one of those issues where it's and it is something that ideally politicians and the media would be focused on, which is how do you take a big systemic thing and break it down into things that would fix it? And part of the problem is that often the things we're told would fix it, don't fly as much, or, don't drink out of a plastic straw, just doesn't pass people's credibility test. They're like, well, that's not going to solve it. That's going to save the polar bears. So yeah, it's one of those ones where we urgently need people to break it down and be like, these are the changes that would actually make a difference and galvanize people into doing stuff. Thank you for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar. You can follow us on social media at over_under_pod_. See you next week.